I finally got to chapter 4 of How to Be Funny.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I stopped at
You're
chapter
funny
3.
Nice.
And then I stopped, and then I realized I wasn't getting any funnier, so I stepped it up a notch.
And how is chapter 4?
It's mostly about hyperbole, which I think is a bad idea in disaster response because I think engaging in hyperbole never works out well.
Yeah, probably not a good idea.
How many chapters are there?
I think there are 11.
I would love
chapters.
to know the chapter names too. That's a really good question.
They're really things like, well, now I don't remember. See, what I should have in chapter 8, they tell you about witty comebacks, and I haven't gotten that far. But when I get
so you're only a third as funny, right?
That's right. I'm getting fractionally more funnier every time. And the voice
you can only go up.
I hope so. I don't know if that's true though, because I feel like some people reach a plateau of funniness and then they decline. Like I'm going to cite Martin Short as an example. He got really funny, and now I think he's leveled off.
Yeah,
I don't think he's going to get any more funny.
Right. Yeah.
I just want to tell everybody that voice that you hear, that is Jack Herman, who I'm going to categorize as our first power guest, not just a guest, but a power guest.
I think you're being too generous.
We're moving up in the podcast world, that's for sure.
That's right. Craig Fugate's next. We're coming for you, Craig. But we're going to talk to Jack tonight about a bunch of things. He's going to be on for the whole show, and I'm like really excited about it. We're going to talk about 9/11, and we're going to talk about the parties that Jack used to throw after the preparedness summit. No, probably not, actually.
Right. Speaking of disasters.
Oh,
we'll see about that.
The morning after.
Cue theme music. Okay, so Jack, I'm now going to introduce you for real. So you tell me how I do, okay?
Sure.
So you are now a Senior Program Officer for the National Academy of Sciences, Institute of Medicine, Board on Health Sciences Policy. And before that, you were the Senior Advisor in Chief of Public Health Programs, and you had a whole other portfolio at NACCHO of all kinds of things, infectious diseases, informatics, environmental health projects. And you have this really distinguished career, and I'm saying that actually without air quotes of any kind, going back to the Northridge earthquake, which I didn't even know, and including the stuff we'll talk about tonight in terms of 9/11 and the Red Cross mental health response. So
I did great job. Yeah, I'm a disaster guy. I'm old and been doing this stuff for almost 25 years.
I'd love to.
Hard to believe.
How did you get into it originally, Jack?
It's funny because it just was on a whim. I was working at the University of Rochester Medical Center in the Department of Psychiatry, and I was coordinating a suicide research center there. And a friend of mine who was a social worker at the time in the department came up to me one day and she said, "Hey, the Red Cross is having a disaster mental health training this weekend. Do you want to go?" And I'm like, that sounds kind of cool. I was into crisis work, crisis mental health work, and I thought, sure, I have nothing else I'm doing. So this was October of '93, and we took the course over the weekend, and I just got into it. There were a lot of people in there who had been on different disasters like Hurricane Andrew and other kinds of events, and I just got really jazzed about it. It piqued my interest, and finished the course, and didn't really think anything, of it, after that. But must have been a few months later. What was it? January of '94, the Northridge earthquake outside of L.A. happens, and I get a call from the Red Cross saying, "Hey, you took this course in a few months ago.
That's a massive recruiting
you want to go to Northridge?
One course in.
It's a bait and switch. Here's some free training. Now you're deployed to an earthquake.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, I mean, so it's a funny story, and I talked to my boss, and he's like, "Sure, go ahead," and they sent me off for 2 weeks to Northridge, and that was kind of the beginning of being hooked in disasters.
Right. Trial by fire. Wow. I guess it's the best way to learn.
Yeah, I love that about disaster response, right? That you can have all of these other skill sets, and then you get thrown into kind of the thick of it, and people either find like it works for them as an environment or they can't handle it. But if it works for you, then you found this like lifelong career.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a adrenaline junkie anyway. So to me, initially the thought is, what the hell am I doing? I have no idea what I'm getting myself into. But it was an amazing, amazing experience.
What was that first day like at Northridge when you land on the ground? Yeah. What was your first job?
Well, this is so funny because normally when you go on an assignment with the Red Cross, your first day is orientation.
Sure.
And they orient you to where you're going to be working and the system and all that. So I get to the headquarters. They tell me, oh, you're one of the first people here. You're going to go up to this room. We're going to do an orientation. So just go up and sit there. So I walk in this room, and it's like a classroom, okay? And there's a phone on a table, and all of a sudden it rings. I'm the only one in the room. And all of a sudden it rings. And so it's ringing, and I'm, looking around. Nobody's coming to answer it. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I'm on candid camera or something,
right,
they're testing me here. So I figure, what the hell? What worse could happen? I mean, they've already had an earthquake. By me answering the phone isn't really going to, do any more damage. And I answered it. And it was somebody looking for some assistance, wanting a particular number. I'm like, I don't really have it, but let me see what I can find. And that was kind of my first experience on the ground there, and trying to figure out, what am I doing here?
Right.
It was very cool, but and those 2 weeks were, like I said, a really valuable experience for me.
There's this perfect metaphor in there about how the only orientation to disaster response is that you just have to start answering the phone.
Right. Just answer the phone.
That's exactly it. You can't be afraid. You can't overthink things. You just got to do what you think is right.
Answer the phone and go find the information.
These are all our own rules for the podcast too, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't overthink it and just dive in.
Find the information.
So we're going to start on our disaster news rundown. And so we're going to start off talking about Nepal. So let me just kind of set this up. So I think by now most people know about the earthquake that struck Nepal on Saturday. The death toll is more than 5,000 at this point. A couple things. The UN has deployed an on-site operations coordination center there, which is like a mini EOC in a box that sort of got flown in and landed. And the thing that I didn't know about the earthquake was it's the same magnitude as the San Francisco earthquake from 1906. So it's sort of that level of disaster that we're talking about. Jack, you had a couple of points on this. Do you want to lay anything out?
Yeah, I think when people look at this stuff and that happens in other parts of the world and watch CNN, they forget that this stuff can happen here. Nepal is a developing country and may not have the same kind of building codes that we do here in the U.S., but, all it takes is the right size earthquake in a vulnerable community in this country, and you're going to see some of the same challenges and devastation and issues. And so, these are our opportunities to really look inside of us and say, what if something like that happened here? Are we ready? Do we know how we would deal with this? And you're seeing these scenes emerge on CNN and other newscasts where they're doing primitive health care in waiting rooms and in any available space they possibly can. And people are so used to our luxurious healthcare systems by Nepal standards, and don't really think about the fact that what they see happening now in Nepal could happen here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, even New York City, since the 70s has had building codes that are, have taken into account earthquake preparedness. But I live on a block in Brooklyn full of brownstones that were built in the 1860s. Those things aren't up to earthquake code. And if we have an earthquake here, I mean, there's going to be serious problems.
Yeah, unreinforced masonry. That's like
that's like the worst thing to be in, right? In an earthquake.
Yeah. What strikes me is like there's this dichotomy between Nepal does have this kind of third world, building up infrastructure, but at the same time, this is the first mass deployment of Facebook's safety check feature, which is this feature that is on Facebook. So you log into it, and based on your location, it can tag you as being in the earthquake zone, and then you can mark yourself as a user as safe when then all your friends know you're safe. So their first mass deployment of this is in Kathmandu. Right, which is really this dichotomy between the oldness of the infrastructure and then these kind of new technologies overlaid on top of that. It's a great advance, this Facebook feature. I don't know how many people are actually using it. I don't have numbers.
It's a great kind of unintended benefit of social media. I feel like it's a good reason to be on it, and I think a lot of organizations could use it to quickly find out if their staff. I know I have a grad school friend who works for WFP in Nepal, and he's on Facebook, he's on LinkedIn, but he's not very active, and we haven't heard from him, and we're all trying to find out if he's okay. But this is it's a great way to get in touch with people.
Acronym check. What's WFP?
World Food Program.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that.
That should be a new segment. Acronym check.
Acronym check. I wanted to get your thoughts on something, Jack, which is, so the news today, so it's Tuesday. This happened on Saturday, which means we're 72 hours out. 72 hours out is the classic news paradigm, in my experience, for when folks on the ground start saying the response is too slow. So we saw that today. A lot of the coverage was about sort of the slowness of the response and whether, that material was getting there. And, when I was watching it, it seemed like we talked about Vanuatu a couple episodes ago. And in that case, there was no landing strip for planes. And in this case, they're able to land, but then the supplies are being held up in warehouses because they don't have helicopters to get out into the rural areas. So I guess I just wanted to ask you guys, do you think this is happening slower than usual? Have you heard anything about the response, or does it seem to be sort of well coordinated on the ground? I don't know if they talked about this at WCDM or anything.
So I think there are two primary issues that you're raising. One is people's expectation of what they think should happen in disaster often contradicts kind of the realities of disaster. And that is, most of the time, people don't want to think about preparedness. But when disasters strike, they expect that their government and others are going to be there and act swiftly and kind of, be on this white horse riding in with everything they need in order to take care of themselves and recover. The reality is disasters are complex, no matter how small or how big. And managing something of this magnitude is extremely difficult and challenging. You named a few things like having, access to rural areas, being able to store supplies and be able to deal with the logistics of getting those supplies out to where they need to be, even knowing where they need to be. Because the worst thing is, transporting some kind of product to a place that doesn't need that. And so, these initial hours, and in this case, with the magnitude of this particular disaster, 72 hours is still like you're in the first hours. Yeah. I suspect it is, just as chaotic as it was in those initial moments, hours, after the disaster on Saturday. So people's expectations are it should be moving quicker. The reality is it can't. There are too many moving pieces here. All of this needs to be coordinated in order to get people the things that they need, get the right product in the right place at the right time and be able to use it to help.
I think that's a great point, Jack. I mean, isn't there a real danger, and have you seen this in past disasters with kind of an over-response at the beginning with dumping unneeded things too early, and it just really complicates the response?
Absolutely. I mean, I've done large-scale disasters like Katrina and Hurricane Sandy where, there's well-intentioned people, but they're bringing in things like food and that gets spoiled because nobody knows it's there.
Right.
Or they bring in these supplies. I think, in Katrina, we got lots of donations of winter coats. Well, who needs a winter coat in August? That's not the right time for that particular, item. So there's a lot of coordination that goes into this. And like I said, I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people and organizations, but all of that needs to be synchronized and orchestrated very closely and strategically in order to ensure you are able to meet the needs of the people who are affected.
So, in watching the coverage of this, I've actually been impressed by two things. I was impressed by the speed with which they got a joint operations coordination center set up on the ground there, which I know is one of the critiques of the Vanuatu response. And two, when the citizen complaints were raised to the governments, they said what I think is the best thing for a government to say is they laid out their priorities. They said we need to do mountain search and rescue first, then we'll work on food distribution to shelters. They laid out a clear set of operational priorities, which I think is both a communications lesson and a tactical lesson for managing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and you hit the nail on the head when you said communication, because, my experience, like I said, doing this work over 20 years, I've had an opportunity to review a lot of after-action reports for different events, and the same things, the same themes and challenges come up over and over and over again in every after-action report, the primary one being communication or the lack thereof. Yeah. And, we still haven't mastered this as to, what is the information that people want? When do they want it? What form do they want it in? And how do you convey it in ways that people understand what's going on and can appreciate the complexities of response?
So I broke out in the kind of the research for this segment, I broke out the Nepal Disaster Management Plan for Natural Disasters, which the last draft of which I found was in 1999, but it laid out the history of the seismic record of Nepal, which goes back to 1255. So I know that there were earthquakes in 1408, 1681, 1810, 1833, and 1866, as well as the one people talk about, which is the 1934 earthquake that was an 8.4 on the Richter scale and killed 17,000 folks. And I bet that communications was in the after-action reports of every single one of those.
Yeah. I'm sure it was.
Well, Jack, in the conference you just went to, it was in South Africa, correct?
Yes.
Did they talk at all about emergency management in developing countries? Is it happening in developing countries, or is emergency management, disaster preparedness as a discipline primarily in developed countries?
Well, it is happening in underdeveloped countries as well, probably, and obviously not as well as it may be happening in developed countries. Right. But this field of emergency management kind of isn't necessarily labeled emergency management. Some of it is, disaster risk reduction. Some of it is emergency preparedness, depending on the country. And so, it is happening. In fact, in Sendai, Japan, in March, about 185 countries got together to look at this disaster risk reduction framework, which is really a global commitment to identifying ways to work globally, locally, regionally, to mitigate risks of disaster, recognizing the impact that human life loss, property, the trillions of dollars that are spent on disaster response, to try to kind of back that up a little and look at how do we mitigate these disasters? How do we reduce our risks and vulnerabilities? And, most of the time, we're very responsive, even in the U.S. While we do spend a lot of our time, kind of planning and preparing, a lot of what we do is really for that response. And, and is kind of emerges as the response, as the incidents happen and the response happens. And so we don't do a lot in the U.S. looking at kind of disaster risk reduction. And so there was this meeting in Sendai, Japan, and all of these countries got together, including the U.S. representatives, and really kind of fostered this 15-year commitment now called the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction and looking at a variety of different priorities and target goals that show this movement towards reducing risk and vulnerabilities across the globe for disaster.
Wow. So I think that's a great step. I think that's the conference the president of Vanuatu was at, actually, when that disaster happened. I remember reading about that at the time. I guess just to say our hearts really go out to all the folks in Nepal, and we'll put links up with the podcast for how everybody out there can listen and support the response efforts.
So the next news story we're going to talk about is how the District of Columbia, a report came out from the District of Columbia's Homeland Security Commission 2013 annual report that said the district was not prepared for an electronic attack or an attack on the electronic infrastructure. And the article focuses on the District of Columbia, but I think what it is saying really could be applied to any area. There's a quote here from the article that says the district is in an urban area with great resilience on systems and functions that are vulnerable to cyber attacks, including a complex overlay of federal and local government facilities and functions, as well as critical infrastructure under both public and private control. I mean, that DC has a large federal government footprint, but most large cities certainly have government, maybe not as many federal agencies, but it was an interesting article because the district is really being pushed to develop a cybersecurity kind of czar for the district that is going to conduct these cyber risk assessments and really look at what would happen if there was a catastrophic loss of electrical power for a long period of time. And, I think it's something interesting to think about. And I'm just wondering both of your opinions, if this is something that cities are going to move more toward and kind of pull this out of the traditional IT department's kind of secondary priority to really make this something that is a focus for agencies.
Dude, cyber attacks terrify me.
I think that's
scary, right?
A great.
Did we lose Jack?
I don't know. Did we lose you?
Nope, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We're being cyber attacked right now. North Korea's shutting us down.
It's a great question because I have to admit, this cyber security stuff actually kind of frightens me because I think we are woefully ill-prepared for this. Having looked at this issue a few years ago, starting to look into this issue a few years ago, and understanding from the kind of the security intelligence community where some of our risks and vulnerabilities are, it is frightening to think about the systems we rely on every day being compromised. I don't know, Mitch, you were in New York City during the blackout, right? And I happened to be there as well. At that time, I was doing some training for the Red Cross. And, all the power went out, and immediately everybody's thinking, this was in the aftermath of 9/11, and people are thinking terrorists. But, once that was ruled out and we understood the origin of it, to think about the way that city then dealt with the challenges that were before it. I mean, being in New York City, kind of, anybody who goes there knows if you're down on Broadway or anywhere else, there's always these lights, and it's just this vibrant city, whether it's day or evening. And being there when all the lights are off is a very eerie feeling. And I happened to, be in the Red Cross headquarters that night, and listening to the fire calls and the response from EMS, and it was a scary experience. And in the big scheme of things, that really wasn't that significant of an incident compared to what could happen. And so, I think we are compelled now to kind of look at this issue outside of the IT world and begin to think of what, we need to do in order to prepare for the types of cyber attacks that this nation could face and the resulting issues and challenges that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think Just looking at how the White House and the State Department handled this last set of hacks that they were dealing with, I think we haven't thought enough about cyber attack as something like a radiological incident, actually.
Right, in the catastrophic terminology, right?
Yeah, but also because of the way, people talk about radiation or biological incidents inciting this kind of fear or mental health distress because of their invisibility. And I think the virtual nature of a cyber attack makes it very hard to sort of understand how to respond to it emotionally. And that aspect of it is something that we haven't talked about. But I think that really is grounded in disaster response techniques.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's not something we can kind of initially see or put our hands around, and so I think a lot of people stick their head in the sand, and that's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wonder if this, kind of like other disasters, it'll take a big disaster for us to kind of wake up about it.
Well, what we need to do is use Periscope. Are we Periscoping this?
Oh, we're
now?
not. I couldn't because I couldn't hear Jack on it.
Oh, yeah.
Jack, have you downloaded the Periscope app?
I haven't.
It's basically it does live video and audio streaming from your mobile device.
And we tried to video stream our podcast. So what we need to do is just Periscope any hackers that are out there. You know what? We won't know who they are, but they'll be on Periscope because they'll be like, look how cool.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, it's time for my favorite segment, which we haven't actually had it in a little while.
Drone Watch.
Which is Drone Watch.
Drone Watch.
Drone Watch. So we actually haven't. So Mitch and I, Jack, as you know, as a huge loyal fan of the podcast, are big drone fans, or just interested in them.
Big drone fans.
And so there's
future drone overlords. We love you, Ultron. You might try.
We're trying to get in good with the drones for when they take over the world. We'll survive. But in Japan, a story came out recently that a person flew a drone carrying radioactive soil onto the prime minister's roof, and he had also targeted other facilities, including I believe a U.S. base. He is upset because he believes that the U.S. wants Japan to reopen their nuclear reactors. And so this is interesting on a lot of levels. One, I think you have, drones. We saw the drone land on the White House, which that wasn't a terrorist attack. He was just kind of flying it near the White House. But you have here them using, someone using a drone, using a new kind of innovative way, weaponizing it basically in a way that I don't think anybody thought about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm worried this is going to happen all the time. I mean, the news that struck me was in Tokyo at the same week that this happened, Crocs, the like plastic rubber shoe things.
Right, yeah.
Their store in Tokyo, they opened a new shoe store in Tokyo that is staffed only by drones. So both in Tokyo the same week, drones were putting radioactive sand on the prime minister's office, and they were delivering your shoes for you.
Wow.
And I think that sort of level of normalcy means that this could happen all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think when one person starts doing this stuff, it does spread like wildfire. People see, unfortunately, the opportunity, and I suspect there are lots of people who are already considering these nefarious uses of drones before this one happened here. But it does again make you really stop and think. Wow, I never would have thought about this, and now this is one more kind of risk and vulnerability we have to plan for.
Absolutely, yeah, and it really highlights the challenge for law enforcement to have to think way out front of people who are thinking up these things to try to get ahead of some of these dangers.
And the inciting incident for this was Fukushima, obviously, and his contention, whoever this kind of, I don't want to really glorify him by saying his name, but the guy that flew the drone, talking about Fukushima was being misrepresented, and it was like the worst radiation incident, even worse than Chernobyl, all that kind of stuff. And I guess I feel like, so we have two things here. We have both the drone threat itself, but also this idea that disasters after they occur become opportunities for political statement. So drones could both be integrated in disasters, but also we could have all of these political statements that will make future disaster responses more difficult, because they're being droned about all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it also points to how important having good intelligence sources and systems in place, need to be, because we rely on those systems to anticipate and help us see what is happening across the world and what presents particular vulnerabilities for us. And most people look at that level of intelligence, especially in the U.S., as kind of stepping all over our rights to privacy and things like that. And, it's hard to balance those issues, because while we want to live in a free society, we also understand or need to understand the risks and vulnerabilities of living in a free society.
Yeah, that's a great point. And back to the earlier discussion about communication. I mean, this is a great example of how the intelligence community, communicating to, say, the health community that, hey, this is a threat, this is a possible hazard, and, getting health departments involved in, then working with law enforcement to respond to something like this. Oh, this is radiation, this is how we respond to it.
Yeah, and I think that key point about radiation is important, because a guy, has a bag full of sand and he lands on the prime minister's office, it's a joke. But as soon as you irradiate that sand, even if there's no threat to human health, suddenly it's international news.
Right.
And
how did he radiate it?
I think he microwaved it. I don't know.
So very low level. Not really.
It didn't have a lot, and it wasn't a radioactive material, so it had been it wasn't actually microwave, right? Obviously, but it was just irradiated in some way. So I think it was pretty not harmful.
You microwave sand. What if that was like how you?
Let's do that. Dukes of Hazzard's experiment. We will microwave sand.
You heard it here. You could microwave sand and turn it into
that's right.
a dirty bomb.
We'll make a build it at home kit, your own drone
right.
plus sand in a microwave, and the authorities will be at your door. Yes. So we're gonna move into kind of our main discussion segment here, and I want to highlight that just for me personally, it's always a little hard to talk about 9/11. It's hard to frame it. It's such a big thing. It's such a powerful impact on the sort of American imagination, that it can be hard to focus on one particular issue of it, if that makes sense. And I think today, Jack, you were the disaster mental health volunteer lead for the Red Cross during that incident. And so we're going to try and focus on the behavioral and mental health issues, both sort of that day and in the days and weeks following.
Sure.
And so I guess I'm wondering if we could, by way of framing, and this is kind of putting a lot of burden on you as a guest, but if you can just take it from your perspective and talk about sort of that day a little bit, and how and we're going to post a link to your article, if you don't mind, which I think was a very good summation. No news wasn't good news. But if you can kind of talk us through it, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, even all these years later, 9/11 probably had the biggest emotional impact on me than any disaster that I ever did prior to 9/11 or since 9/11. It was really one that defined for me kind of how disaster response takes its toll on the individuals who are called in to, whether they volunteer or are first responders, police, fire, EMS, whoever comes in for that response, and the impact that something that catastrophic can have. But it started out pretty ironic for me. On that that Tuesday morning, I was heading into my office at the University of Rochester, and I had been, as you said, I was the disaster mental health lead for New York State for the Red Cross, and there was a meeting that day downstate in Albany for the disaster leaders of Red Cross. And at the same time, the Rochester airport was having a meeting to talk about an upcoming aviation disaster drill. So I was elected to stay back from the statewide meeting to participate in this drill planning meeting. So left my office, at about 8:30, on my way to the airport for the meeting. And the moment I walked in the door, they said, a plane has struck the World Trade Center. I'm like, what? And, the TV's on. And I immediately called the disaster lead for the Red Cross, who was down in Albany at this meeting, and we're on the phone. And she's like, yeah, I know. It's, we're watching it as well. And at that point, as I was on the phone with her, the second plane went into the towers. And, her words were, just get there. So the airport manager took me down, and this was still when the flights, the airspace wasn't closed down. So we started at, one of the airlines, and he's like, I need to get this guy down to New York. And so, first of all, I'm not even thinking I'm going to get on a plane and fly, to New York City. Right. But that was just that's what I knew I needed, I needed to get there. So as we're trying to get me on a flight, they're like, oh, we just closed. Our airline just closed down. And so he brought me to the next airline and trying to do the same. And then all of a sudden, everything's closing down. So I called, back down to the lead, and she said, just get a van, rent a van, go over to the chapter, get some supplies. I knew what I needed. And so, I did that. I ran home. I packed a bag, not knowing how long I was going to be there, put some clothes in. And I'm on my way, and I joined a caravan of people from Western New York, first responders, driving down to New York City. So, this is probably 11 o'clock in the morning, and we're driving. What was really eerie, we're the only ones on the road, and we're flying down the interstate, and as I'm going down, I'm talking also with the Red Cross National Headquarters, and so I was asking, what am I getting into? What are we going to do? And they're like, well, they're setting up, a headquarters in New York City at the New York City chapter of the Red Cross. You're just going to go there, and and I said, well, when are you guys going to get there? Meaning the leadership team from DC, the headquarters, and they're like, we're not. We can't get out of here. That by that time, the Pentagon and and Pennsylvania had happened, and they're like, this is you. You're going to go down there and you're going to work with the folks and I'm like, well, what am I going to do? And they're like, you're just going to do what you do. And so I drove down. I am coming up in Lower Manhattan. I'm driving over fire hoses and debris, and and I can still see, by that time, obviously the towers had collapsed, but I could still see flames and the fire, and it was just so surreal. And then I pulled up to the Red Cross, which is up on 66th Street, West 66th, and there were hundreds of people in line. Many of them had showed up either to donate blood or donate money, but there were a lot of volunteers there. And so, my first job was to kind of meet with the New York City disaster services team, who had when the planes struck, went down towards the World Trade Center, and then as the buildings were collapsing, they needed to kind of flee that area and go back to the chapter and start, figuring out what we were going to do. And so I went in and met with them first. And obviously they were very shook up, and they knew there were a lot of their friends, first responder friends, were in, those buildings, and obviously they were concerned for their safety. I mean, they were survivors in essence. Even though they were responders, they were now survivors by the very fact that this incident, happened to them in their city, to people they knew, to themselves. And then, one of my first tasks was to figure out, okay, how are we going to organize this? What kind of, sites? By that time, people were evacuating in these makeshift shelters and other kind of centers were opening up for people who had evacuated the buildings or couldn't get out of the city home to New Jersey, Connecticut, wherever. And, the real challenge was we had all these people who wanted to volunteer, and you have no idea who these people are. They're very well intentioned, like I said, but I have no idea who they are. I don't know what credentials they had. I mean, if I had maybe a nickel for everybody who told me they were a trauma specialist, behavioral trauma specialist, I'd be rich and on some remote island right now, not even talking to you guys. But those initial hours were just crazy and frenetic. Even though you spend a lot of time kind of planning, when it happens, something of that magnitude, the nature of this business is it's frenetic and frenzied in those early moments. So that was the first experience, and so we spent a lot of those initial hours just trying to get some situational awareness on what was going on, what was the health department, New York City Health Department doing, what was the mayor's office doing, what kinds of resources did we have available to us, what kind of system could we put in place in order to ensure that we were mobilizing volunteers who were going to do what we needed them to do, as opposed to putting them more at risk. And so with the lack of information that comes in early on, you're just kind of flying by the seat of your pants. And at that point, there was no social media to rely on to kind of monitor and see what's happening. You just did the best you can.
So one thing you said there was that all the responders sort of themselves became survivors. And I think when we got into immediate response, can you talk about sort of how that affected things and what you needed to do to sort of help those survivors?
Well, I needed to remember that not to intrude at that moment. Many mental health professionals who might be faced with this situation might put that mental health hat on and say, okay, I gotta get these people and have them start talking about this experience, or find some way to help them be emotionally protected against what they're dealing with. And first responders are trained to respond, and they're also oftentimes trained to put their own needs aside. And so, I needed to remember not to intrude, to let them know that I was there, but also not get in the way, because they had a job to do in that initial aftermath. And no matter whether I not thought that, they should be doing it or shouldn't be doing it, they knew what they needed to do, and I needed to be able to respect that. And so staying out of the way was kind of what I needed to do. That was the first line of business. But as the response progressed, I was able to talk with some of the leaders of the various first responder organizations to begin to plant the seed about, okay, what kind of mental health and behavioral health support will your staff need? And it was hard, frankly, for them to even consider that in those initial hours, days, even the first couple weeks.
Yeah, I'm curious how quickly did the mental health issues start to come up? I tend to think of 9/11 as in phases of immediately life-saving and response, and then recovery, and then eventually rebuilding. But I'm curious, did they come immediately? Did you immediately have first responders coming forward, or did it take a little while just to kind of get through the initial shock of everything?
So, I think the response, the behavioral response, and the mental health response can happen right away in some people. Obviously, they were faced with this threat of injury or death to themselves or the people they cared about. And that can elicit a lot of feelings and reactions. And so there were some who were very, very stoic and kind of had their mind focused on what they needed to do. There were others who were very emotionally fragile because they, the experience obviously was so palpable for them that it was hard for them to put those reactions and feelings aside. They were so overwhelming and so powerful that it was hard for them to contain. And then you have everything else, in the middle. So it really is a continuum. And, we saw reactions that ran the gambit from, like I said, people being panicked and fearful and to sad or angry, or, you saw a little bit of everything.
So what was it like actually operationally? You know what I mean? If you put the hat on, if you could try and put yourself back in that situation, did you set up clinics? Was it phone consultations? How were the responders able to find you guys? How did you make those connections?
For me, it wasn't, I in particular wasn't focused on responders. So my job was to help establish the Family Assistance Center with the mayor's office and the New York City Department of, Health and Mental Hygiene. And so there was a team of us from those agencies that at 4:00 in the morning on the 12th went to the NYU Medical Center, because that's where the mayor at the time had determined that's where the first Family Assistance Center was. And I had had some previous experience in setting up Family Assistance Centers during the 1996 TWA Flight 800, as well as, also working in various centers for other disasters. And so, we walked in the door that 4:00 and we're surveying the grounds, and they wanted to open the center in what was a grand rounds room. A typical medical center grand rounds room holds about, 350 people. My first comment was, this won't do. Mm-hmm. It's not going to hold enough people. And they're like, well, this is what we have right now. And so the plan was to open that next morning. I forget what time it was, maybe 8 or 7. And so, we got our staff put together, Red Cross and others, and we opened the door, and within minutes there were thousands of people in line.
Oh my gosh.
And, we got the first however many, 350 people in, and I got up on stage. There was a stage there because obviously everybody wants to know what's going to happen. And I said, look, I know you're all here you want information on your loved ones. We don't have that information yet. And I know this is the hardest thing you're going to be dealing with, not knowing. I said, but we're going to do our best. And I explained then what the process was going to be, which is, they were going to meet with representatives from the police department and the medical examiner's office to do what's called a victim information profile. And that's when we gather information on who it is they lost and physical characteristics, what they might have been wearing that day. And it's a very grueling, painful process when all you want to do is find your loved one, and you have somebody asking you all of these questions. And unfortunately, some of these questions give you the sense that all they want to know about are the deceased. You're giving me this information because I need to identify the deceased. Mm-hmm. And nobody wants to think about that.
Right. At that one day after. This is one day after, right?
Right. Hours. Right. Less than 24 hours or so. And so we started that process, and then and we had mental health professionals who would sit, and spiritual care professionals who would sit with the police or the medical examiner staff as they're going through this interview. But it was agonizing. You could see it, agonizing and painful for these people to sit there waiting for their number to be called, and knowing there were, thousands of people outside still waiting in line, not able to get in to the building. And so a determination was made then to relocate to the new building, Children and Family Services, that was it hadn't even been opened. I think it had been renovated. And so the mayor's office decided they were going to open it up. And so I didn't have a chance to go and look at it before, but some others did and said, it's still not going to be optimal. And so when it was ready to open, we got everybody up who was currently in the auditorium, and we redirected the line, and we kind of almost single-filed everybody that walked down the street to this new building. And what we found is it had smaller waiting room space, but more interview rooms. But some of the people who had been in the NYU Medical Center auditorium now were back outside. And so there was almost this, riot, because they're like, I was inside, and they were all fighting for their place, recognizing that, their hope is the sooner they could have this interview, the sooner somebody could tell them where their loved one was.
Right.
So, we worked on that. I think it was for a couple days before we moved everything over to the 26th Street Armory.
So you moved twice at that point.
Yeah, well, we ended up moving, 3 times? So it was, NYU, then the Children and Family Services building, then the 26th Street Armory, before we went over to the pier.
So what was that like for you as a responder? Because on that second, you'd been up for 24 hours anyway.
Well, interesting. I had been up probably just less than 24. They sent me to bed probably around 1 o'clock in the morning and said, you've got to get some rest. It's going to be a long day. And so I went to the hotel. I turned on, CNN and in the news, and I just couldn't sleep. And the funny part is I had conducted an interview, a media interview earlier that afternoon, and I'm hazy laying in bed listening to it, and I'm like, hear this familiar voice, and I look up and I'm like, oh yeah, I know that guy, but it was kind of weird, seeing that, and then had to get up to go to the 4 o'clock meeting. But it was, like I said, I think I was just in this cloud. I was just kind of running on whatever energy I had, doing what I thought was going to be helpful. I was working with a great team, and just doing the best that we could, and just trying to keep up, because there's no way we could have attended to everything, we needed to do at that point. It was just too big.
And I want to know, that Family Assistance Center in particular was really integral to New York City's later planning efforts, and I think nationally, in terms of how you put facts together in ways that are humane and helpful for people involved. You got it set up. It moved to the pier. How did the issues kind of change over that first week? Did you see a difference?
I think, again, that first week, it still felt like the first day, frankly. It was incredibly busy. We were working 14, 16-hour days. Families were, again, just so anguished and wanting information about their loved ones, recognizing, obviously, a few days into it, that, they were trying to hold on to that hope as best that they could, but having witnessed other family members around them who were getting news about their deceased loved ones made it harder and harder to hang on to that hope, and that pain was palpable in this building. It's hard to be in a building where there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people, of grieving family members who are waiting, for that news that they don't want to happen, and that they don't want to hear, but trying to find a way to be present with them, be respectful of their space, not intrusive to what they were feeling and their reactions, but letting them know that someone was there that they could lean on or talk to or share their thoughts and feelings with.
Wow. So that, that crisis moment, when could you feel, because we're trying to, I guess I want to just connect the arc of the story together. When could you feel that crisis moment was passing? Did it pass? Did it get less intense, or did the sadness just kind of transmute into a different feeling?
It really didn't change because there were so many people affected, and it took a long time for some of these family members to get the news, and others didn't get it for a long time. And, so there was always that kind of angst hanging in the air. And, it's not like it was this sadness that then kind of transformed into this, kind of stable, environment. It always had its kinds of ups and downs, and especially in those first few days where family members did find their loved ones because they evacuated somewhere and they couldn't get home. And, so there were some of those, few, but some of those where the family member called them and, they were reconnected. But the majority of them obviously didn't. They wanted that call, and there were many who just thought, even days, weeks into it, thought that maybe their family member was lying in a hospital amnestic, that it was that kind of grain of hope that, so many days or weeks later that they tried to hang on to.
Mm. Well, I know that so many things changed after 9/11, the discipline of emergency preparedness. So many things were learned from that response. And I know one thing the city did was keep a registry of anyone who worked or responded or even lived in Lower Manhattan during this time. And they still, track the long-term kind of health effects of being in Lower Manhattan during 9/11. Was anything done like that on the mental health side? Was there a registry created to look at the long-term impact of mental health?
Yeah, that same World Trade Center health registry does track mental health. So I'm in that registry. So the other night I got a call from the registry saying, your annual check-in is due, and so we have to schedule a time for them to go through this survey so that they can see, if I have any continued symptoms or reactions or anything that they can link back to 9/11. And so this particular registry covers both behavioral health and physical health.
So what kind of behavioral health issues have they seen over time? I mean, have a lot of the people who've seen physical health issues also seen mental health issues? Are they kind of different cohorts? What are the findings?
So, I think it's important to appreciate that most people who go through a disaster, even something as catastrophic as 9/11, will actually emerge mentally fine. They may have some, short-term reactions, transient reactions, but most of that, the vast majority, those reactions will dissipate over time. There is a smaller subset that will go on to develop more long-term, more significant psychological or psychiatric reactions. And these are the folks we are trying to identify early on so that we can provide the appropriate support and treatment so that they don't endure this long-standing psychological pain. And so that's part of what we do as, from a disaster mental health perspective is we're providing this kind of comfort care in the early aftermath while looking for particular signs and symptoms from individuals that may go on to develop more significant reactions that are going to be more difficult to, maybe treat later on.
Wow. What do you think are the main lessons learned or takeaways that you would give to somebody else in your position in a future disaster? Like what are the things you would want them to know that you kind of wish you knew going into that?
Well, I think we did learn a lot of lessons around how to set up family assistance centers and the type of support that families will look for in the immediate aftermath of a mass casualty incident. And I think we've become much more sophisticated in our approach to working with families, making sure they are part of the decisions that get made when setting up these family assistance centers, like the types of services that they're going to need, the types of support they're going to need, and the types of information that they're going to want access to. So I think we have learned a lot. I think we also recognize the importance of not pathologizing early on, in that most of these folks, while the reactions that they have are expectable, and we anticipate that people are going to have these kinds of reactions after such events, most of them are going to do fine. And all they need is some basic care and support to get them through it. But we do have to pay attention to those who are most vulnerable and at risk of developing more significant reactions, and determining what they may need at that moment in time in order to prepare for what needs they may have further on down the line.
Wow. It's a riveting story even now. I think there are a lot of critical lessons there. Jack, you're a better guest than we deserve.
Yeah, that's true.
Sure.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that.
So let's go to our listener question.
So this is a great opportunity to have you on for this listener question. So this one via Twitter is from @ScottNorth, and he says, how do professional emergency managers coordinate with individual volunteers or volunteer groups?
Great question.
Yeah, so maybe we can just briefly talk about our own experience doing that. Jack, how have you used individual volunteers and volunteer groups in the past?
So, this is, again, an important lesson learned from 9/11 and other, disasters where volunteers, again, well-intentioned, but come out of the woodwork and want to help. Many of them ill-prepared to deal with the situations around a disaster, just because of the lack of experience or training. And so, the first kind of rule is, if you're interested in volunteering in a first responder capacity or whatever, you need to be affiliated with an organization that does that. You need to be trained ahead of time. You need to be registered. You need to be prepared for the environment that you're going to be walking into. And so from the emergency management perspective, much of their time in the planning phase is finding ways to connect with organizations that are involved in response, who are training responders, making sure they understand what those agencies' roles and responsibilities are, how they train their volunteers, and that when disasters like 9/11 happen, or Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, which are so big that we're going to have to use spontaneous volunteers, that there's a system in place to know who you have in front of you and be able to vet that individual and their knowledge, experience, and skill sets before you just send them out on their own.
Yeah, and I got to think after 9/11, this just exponentially the ability to do this must have exponentially increased as far as credentialing and plugging in volunteers at the time of emergency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole emergency system now in place at each state level, trying to register their volunteers to identify what skill sets and knowledge base they come in with, what types of roles they'll play during disaster. And so there has been a greater effort over the years to pre-register volunteers so that we know we are sending the right person to the right place at the right time to do the right thing.
Yeah, and one of the best organizations I've seen here in New York City is the Medical Reserve Corps, specifically for medical staff. That I know that the City Health Department has a very active group that gets medical professionals and mental health professionals into the group, gets them, checks the credentials, gets them trained on disaster preparedness, and then does an amazing job of plugging them in to real responses, but also like large scale exercises and drills too.
And National VOED actually is doing this great new initiative where they're building an app where members of National VOED can show up to a disaster site and then they can register themselves and check in so that their members, even if it's a group from like Georgia, so a group from Georgia comes up to New York City, they want to help. So if they're a National VOED member, they can check in and sort of say, these are our volunteers, and sort of empower them as members of a coalition to help out, which I think is a great use of new technologies.
Yeah, I can't tell you guys how many calls I got in that first week, from various teams across the country and across the world calling saying, hey, I have a team of mental health professionals. We're getting ready to board the plane. Where do you want us? And I said, stay right there. Right now we have as many as we possibly can handle at this time. And if we need you, we'll call you. But we don't want you to self-deploy.
Yeah, recently I've seen a lot in the news, and from previous experience, a lot of community-based organizations that aren't necessarily specific emergency management or disaster preparedness groups have kind of adopted disaster preparedness as a wing of what they do. I'm thinking of the only group I can think of right now is the Red Hook Initiative, is a community-based organization in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn that after Hurricane Sandy, they opened community centers, they opened food banks, they really, and that has continued on, this kind of disaster preparedness arm. And I know the East Village gas explosion that happened, a lot of volunteer organizations have done a ton of work with working with the Red Cross to help families that are in need.
This is a great use for dual-use organizations. I mean, this idea is we credential volunteers for disaster, but if you credential volunteers for some other kind of daily life social activity, then you have a pre-credentialed set of folks that are ready to go in a disaster that you don't have to kind of credential new during the emergency.
Right.
So I think that's a great kind of dual purpose.
Do either of you have experience working with the CERT, Community Emergency Response Teams?
Yeah, I did some work with CERTs in Rochester, maybe 10 years ago when they were forming that CERT program, and they're amazing. It's an amazing group as well. These are people who are very much committed to their community. They want to help, and they go through some training and are connected with emergency management or other agencies. And are a valuable component of a community's response system.
That's great. And most every mid to large, I guess even small cities have CERT teams, right?
I love that. I went to a conference on CERTs, and then they did a session on BERTs, which were business emergency response teams. And I thought, what's the ERNI? Is there an ERNI? And then I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many of these. We could have like ZERTs, like zoological emergency response teams, or we could have like KURTs, like karate emergency response teams. There are so many opportunities for other ERTs that we could start.
That is awesome.
Absolutely.
I guess we got to let you go. I mean, this has been an amazing hour. This is like my favorite Dukes of Hazzard's hour.
This is great. Yeah, we could go another hour, but we won't. But we could.
That's right. Because we're karate emergency response teams, and we can handle it.
Well, Jack, thanks again. Thanks so much for joining us and talking to us and sharing your experience. It's certainly a learning experience for us.
That's right. Right.
I really appreciate it, guys.
Emergency response teams.
It was a lot of fun, and I really appreciated you taking the time to talk about this.
Oh, right. This is, I think, when I have to cue the exit music. Is that right?
That's it.
Review us on iTunes. Follow us at @Hazards Podcast.
Yes. And thank you for listening.
Absolutely.
Jack, we're playing very snazzy music right now, but you can't.
I wish I could hear it. Well, I'll hear it when I listen to the podcast.
Say anything.